I'll wait. Well, it's 10:30 and it's time for brainstorming the human connection, brought to you by the South Dakota Humanities Council. And this is an interactive program, and we like for people to interact, and that's what makes the program happen. Let's put it that way, is sharing of ideas, asking questions, letting people know what your thoughts are. And speaking of thinking, well, one of the mechanisms in our society that prompts us to think is newspapers. And because newspapers represent a kind of nervous system, or one of the parts of our nervous system in a community, those newspapers have become and have been very important in terms of connecting us and connecting our ideas. We may have different ideas about what newspapers are or should be, but most people who are living in a society where we have, let's say, discretionary income and some leisure time, because you need both of those to want to read and want to have newspapers. They have newspapers or have had newspapers. And we have in the last 10 or 20 years seen a very steady decline in newspapers. And so we thought we'd want to have a discussion today about newspapers. One, to give people some kind of idea of the role that they have played and are playing, and also the future of where they will go, what they will be doing or could be doing and might be doing in the future, what they will become. And also just to have a conversation about your interaction with newspapers. What do you want from a newspaper? How do you use your newspaper? Have you felt any changes in the newspaper business and how it relates to you, your family, and the activities that you take in? My guest today is David Bordewyk, and he is the executive director of the South Dakota NewsMedia Association. And he's going to tell us about a recent change in their name, in case you have interacted with them before. Though they kind of act in the background. You know, they're important because they kind of connect all the newspapers. But in many ways, you know, the people who read newspapers don't really know they exist. The news media knows they exist, but a lot of the people who read the newspapers have no idea. It's kind of like, you know, you're driving your car and you become unaware of the transmission. But if it's not working, then you become aware of it. Or your kidneys, you know, it's like nobody sort of feels around and say, oh, I wonder how my kidneys doing. Oh, yeah, seem to be humming along, you know. But if they stop, you know, then we have a discussion, and not just with ourselves. So, David, thanks for joining us. Welcome.
Thank you, Lawrence. I appreciate that. I don't know that I've ever been necessarily, our association's been compared to kidneys or a car transmission before, but I like that. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, you guys make things turn. That's why I think of a transmission.
There you go. That's right. That's right.
You move energy, one kind of kinetic energy from one place to another, and that's you know, it's kind of, to me, that's kind of besides, you know, and also you filter a lot of stuff too. So
keep the presses rolling, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Well,
okay.
Listen, I thank you for the invitation to join this morning, Lawrence, and the Humanities Council and Colby. I appreciate that. This is quite an honor, and I'm very, very appreciative. And look forward to a conversation here and a discussion about what obviously is I think very important work and important part of our society in the news business, newspapers, news media, not only in our neck of the corner of the world here in South Dakota, but obviously across the country, across the world. But so yes, go ahead, Lawrence.
I was going to say, could you start off by telling us what you do? And you mentioned the name change, but I don't know if we got into why the name change. Did you have a different mission, but
right.
Can you talk about what your mission is, how it's
Exactly.
changed, if it's changed, that kind of thing?
So let's talk about how our kidneys work here. Yes. So we are the South Dakota NewsMedia Association, and we are the trade association for all the newspapers and now some digital news outlets in South Dakota who pay dues to belong to our organization, annual dues. We're a nonprofit organization. Although we do have a business affiliate with us, that's part of our operation. But we're an association that helps support newspapers and news organizations in South Dakota through a variety of services, and that includes things such as we lobby and peer. We advocate for First Amendment, for open government, for public notices in newspapers, and for transparency in government, freedom of the press. And so I spend a lot of time in peer during the legislative session on behalf of, as a registered lobbyist for the association. We host an annual convention for all the newspapers and news outlets in South Dakota, where they can come together and share ideas and learn and have fun. And including, we have a contest that goes with that, where newspapers can enter, to win awards for best reporting, best feature writing, sports coverage, all sorts of categories, very competitive contest. We also have a legal hotline. We have an attorney, a longtime attorney in Sioux Falls, John Arneson, who works with all of our member newspapers in terms of working with them on legal questions they may have related to libel or access to courts, access to government records. So we provide a host of services. And on the business side of what we do, our for-profit side, we help sell advertising that goes into all the newspapers across the state. So for instance, if an advertiser wants to advertise in all 105 members of our association, rather than them contacting each of those individually, they can contact our office, and then we help facilitate that placement of advertising. And that's actually a large part of what we do. And so we have a staff of 5 of us here in Brookings who support and operate the association. We're governed by a board of directors who are made up of publishers and managers of our member newspapers and digital news outlets, a 7-member board that meets at least quarterly to give direction and guidance to our association, and oversee in what we're doing. We've been around for over 140 years. Newspapers have been around a long time, and so we've had association a long time. We got the roots of our association go back to Huron, when a group of local editors in the Dakota Territory days, 1882, met in Huron to kind of informally gather and begin a local association of newspaper folks, and that grew into what is now our statewide organization. So related to the name change, just real briefly there, Lawrence. For many years, we were South Dakota Newspaper Association. Prior to that, we were South Dakota Press Association. But since about the late 1980s, we've been the South Dakota Newspaper Association. And the last few years, our board and members have had this discussion about, look, the news environment out there is changing. You've got not only newspapers serving audiences, but you have digital-only news outlets, nonprofit outlets who are serving audiences with good journalism and good news content. And we have that in South Dakota strongly. We've got South Dakota News Watch doing good work, a nonprofit. South Dakota Searchlight, another nonprofit journalism entity doing good work. The Dakota Scout, which is in Sioux Falls, which is sort of a hybrid digital operation along with a weekly print operation. So our association said, look, there's an emergence of these new news outlets beyond just the traditional newspapers we know, and we would like to, include them within our association as well. We would like to make sure that we're sort of, having a big tent here and have all those folks doing good journalism be a part of our association. So what we did this year is we changed our bylaws to allow that to happen, to allow others beyond just traditional newspapers to be members. And then along with that, we changed the name of our association. So now we are South Dakota NewsMedia Association, which reflects not only the 100 plus newspapers, traditional newspapers, but also a handful of these new news outlets that have sprung up the last few years in South Dakota, and they are becoming members of our association. So it's all a very good thing. It's an exciting thing, and it's just very reflective of what's going on within the news environment, not only across America, but here in South Dakota as well. So
you talked a little bit about the history of newspapers. You mentioned it, but I'd like to get a little bit more under the hood. Can you talk to us about how where the newspapers have been? What has been the history of, well, let's say newspapers in general? When did they even start?
yeah,
Because since clay tablets, we might call them news clays, but not newspapers. So
well,
when did that start?
yeah, and I'm by no means an authority or historian on this, the history of newspapers, but I will tell you, just looking back at the history of our country, newspapers and the development of our United States have gone hand in hand. I mean, you can go back to before we were formed before the Revolution, when we were colonies, we had the emergence of newspapers in New England. Among the first newspapers, perhaps one of them better known was a single sheet newspaper called Public Occurrences, which was published in the Boston area in 1689, I believe it was. And you had another newspaper called the Boston Newsletter a few years later, which was the first continuously published newspaper that went on to publish for many, many years. And so, and that all ties into, in Europe, before there was in America, there were newspapers across Europe and into England as well. And that really, quite honestly, ties back to the emergence of the printing press and the Gutenberg printing press in Germany. And when that came along, when that technology came along when they could facilitate the printing of words on paper in an easy way, as opposed to handwriting things on paper or papyrus or whatever the medium had been for centuries. Yes, the press, the emergence of the printing press really is what I think caused for the development of a newspaper in Europe, and we took off from there. So but really in America, it's like I said, the history of our country is tied closely to newspapers as well, because for decades newspapers was the mass medium, and really the only mass medium. I mean, it was prior to the electronic age, before radio, before TV. The daily and weekly newspapers served as the medium to help inform communities, residents, readers about what was happening, and so it's a colorful history, obviously, of what you see in newspapers, and the same is true in South Dakota as well. I mean, the history of newspapers here dates prior to statehood. I mean, one of the first newspapers to be printed was in Sioux Falls in 1859. It didn't last, I think it was, but it was there for a time. And then one of the first newspapers that was a predecessor of what is to the Yankton Press in Dakota today, was founded in Yankton in Dakota Territory days in the 1870s. And that newspaper, like I said, went through some iterations and now is known as the Yankton Press in Dakota. And then also in the Black Hills with the emergence of newspapers in Deadwood, and the Black Hills Pioneer, which is a great newspaper in Spearfish today, published 5 days a week there, traces its roots to Deadwood and the Gold Rush days when a newspaper was founded there as well. So quite a colorful history along the way.
Yes. So if I might, I would like you to talk a little bit more about South Dakota and the role that newspapers have played in South Dakota, because it has always been a kind of spread out state. And
Yes.
so with sparse population, especially literate population, people who were going to pick up a newspaper, even if they were literate, they may not pick up a newspaper. So it doesn't seem like you would start off with a whole bunch of people clamoring, to get your newspaper, but, prove me wrong,
Well, one of the interesting little stories or things about the development of newspapers in here in the Midwest, not just in Dakota, South Dakota, Dakota Territory, but throughout the Midwest, is tied to homesteading of this part of the country. And when a homesteader took a claim, 160 acres, staked a claim, and when they were able to prove up that claim, where they had proved that they had lived on that 160 acres for a time and farmed it and so forth, at some point then they were required to publish a notice in a newspaper proving their claim, saying, look, this 160 acres I've proved up and is now I am the rightful owner of this 160 acres. And so, as you can imagine, lots of homesteading, in the 1870s, 1880s, and into the 1890s, there were a lot of these notices that had to be published. And so some very enterprising individuals began starting newspapers all across the Dakota Territory, and then later South Dakota, with one of the principal reasons to capture the publication of those notices and the revenue that came with it.
Exactly.
In fact, there was a publisher in the western part of the state who was known as the proof claim publisher, because he had several little small town newspapers, many places that don't even exist anymore. And solely what he was doing was capturing revenue that came from the publication of these notices. But from that, Lawrence, you did see obviously many newspapers that did take root within communities and have been in existence since those times. I mean, we have many newspapers today that are 120, 130, 140 years old within our state. And so, the development of our state, the development of Dakota Territory and into statehood and so forth, along with that came the development of newspapers, many that are still, obviously in existence today. And in a very rural state like ours, where, again, population is spread out across many miles, but you have very distinct communities, correct? Right? Small communities, all four corners of the state and everywhere in between. And oftentimes there is a newspaper in those communities that serves that distinct community, because it's one of the things that helps sort of tie things together, keep people informed, keep people connected, and knowing what's going on within their community, and serves in sort of a boosterism role as well. But it's proven obviously to be a very essential thing for small town South Dakota, and as well as our larger communities as well too, is having newspapers that help serve and connect our communities. At one time, and I think it maybe still be true, but we often said, because we had researched this, was that South Dakota had more newspapers per capita than any state in the country. And I think it's still true today. We need to update that research, but it's large part because we just have lots of rural communities that are obviously spread across a wide expanse, and many newspapers serving those many communities as well.
Well, that brings, of course, to the top of the discussion, the financial viability of newspapers, because along with having that, let's say, notoriety of being the most newspapers per capita, it also, reverse of that, means there are fewer people per newspaper, because we don't have a whole bunch of people.
Right.
And I mean, that's what that number says. And if you don't have enough, a whole bunch of people, that suggests that the revenue in terms of like the bang for the buck, costs per impression, so to speak, in the advertising business, the cost per impression is very high, which doesn't seem like it's a real, let's say, financial gold mine, so to speak. Can you speak to
that? Publishing a newspaper has never been a financial gold mine. I think you can look at the history, and very few have gotten rich from being a newspaper publisher. It's been more of a labor of love for many over the years. There's no doubt about it. But for decades, obviously, the business model for newspapers was pretty straightforward. You sold subscriptions, annual subscriptions to readers, or they paid to buy a single copy of the paper at the grocery store, at the convenience store, and you sold advertising that went into the newspaper. Those two revenue streams, subscriptions and advertising, really, were the streams that helped support and funded, kept newspapers, kept the doors open, and paid to get the newspaper printed, and paid for staff, and paid to get it distributed. And that worked well. That business model worked for a long, long time. But then this thing called the internet came along in the 1990s, and like many things, not just the newspaper business but industry, but like many things, it blew up that business model for newspapers, particularly on the advertising side of things, because now those who do market and promote through advertising have other options to do so, whether it be through Facebook ads or through Google and so forth. And oftentimes, those things are very, very inexpensive to do. And even though some may question, at times the effectiveness of that, it's proven to be a very strong competitor for revenue for the newspapers and for other media as well. It's just not newspapers who've suffered from that, but newspapers have really seen it. So that, lots of economic headwinds that have come into play for the business model. And then in recent times, on the cost side, the expense side has gotten to a point where it questions sustainability as well, particularly when it comes to mailing a newspaper to a subscriber in recent times. Just for instance, in the last 3 years, our community newspaper publishers in South Dakota have seen their postage rates gone up 40% over what it was just 3 years ago in order to mail a newspaper to a subscriber. And in a rural state like ours, you need the postal service in order to get your newspaper delivered to a reader, because we're just too rural and too spread out to have private delivery. So the revenue side of things, the expense side of things have created, like I said, some serious headwinds for newspapers, small and large alike, no doubt about it.
So I imagine what's happening now is newspapers are adjusting, and of course, one of the models is using the internet model for gaining revenue, also for distribution. It seems though that many newspapers were, let's say, slow on the uptake for for newspapers, kind of like Kodak, invented the digital camera, but they thought, nobody's going to want that, and so now they're not even a player. What I mean? But they invented the technology. So it seems like newspapers were kind of in that same cultural hub of like, well, that's not really, and we don't do that. That's not our thing. Is there some change now? Is it like new people or what's causing the change now?
Well,
Or is there a change?
and I would maybe take issue a little bit with the idea that maybe newspapers were slow on the uptake to recognize what's happening digitally, because I know from my personal experience of being here at SDNA for almost 30 years that I can recall back in the mid 90s and early 2000s where we had lots of meetings at our conventions and so forth and presentations about moving to a digital age for your newspaper and how you can make money digitally via your newspaper, which some of that's worked out, a lot of it hasn't worked out because in large part because in the advertising world on the internet, it's dominated by a couple big players. I mean, Facebook and Google. They swallow up the advertising world on the internet, and newspapers and other news media are left with basically the scraps on that end. So where perhaps a newspaper at once upon a time was getting $1 for selling an ad in a printed version, they're now getting $0.10 for selling it on the internet. And so you have to collect a lot of dimes in order to pay for your postage and for your printing and so forth. But the other thing too, Lawrence, is so many people still appreciate and value the printed newspaper as well. So while many of our newspapers have worked very hard and are in terms of making that transition to a digital realm and incorporating a digital product and digital outlets into their operation, many readers still appreciate being able to pick up a tangible printed newspaper and have that and appreciate that. So that, for a publisher is a challenge because yes, it'd be quite a bit cheaper and quite a bit easier if I could just put it out all electronically each week or each day and not have to worry about printing a newspaper. But when you have customers who still appreciate that, it's sort of like you're living in two worlds here, the printed world and the digital world, and you got to serve both audiences to some degree to make it work, and that's a challenge economically, no doubt about it. But that's a process that is sorting itself out, and it will continue to do so. There are no easy answers right now for a lot of that, but I think it will sort itself out, and we're seeing some of that happening. For instance, when you look at some of the nonprofit news outlets that have come along, such as just in South Dakota Newswatch and South Dakota Searchlight and some others, who rely in large part on philanthropy, giving of individuals to support their journalism. And that demonstrates that people do value good journalism. They want information and news that keeps them informed, right? They want to know what's happening in the community and across the state, and they're willing to pay and support for that. And so newspapers as well, while they're not necessarily converting all to nonprofit status, but they are recognizing that they have to be more transparent and I think more upfront with their customers and subscribers about, look, if you value the good journalism we're doing in our community, then we need you to help support that and be willing to pay more to subscribe and pay for that newspaper. And you're seeing that happening. The one of our most outstanding newspapers in the state, the Freeman Courier in Freeman, South Dakota, just this past year raised the subscription rate for its newspaper dramatically, just because they were in a position where it was necessary. And talking to the publisher, Jeremy Waltner, recently, I asked him how that was going. How was that dramatic increase in his subscription prices being received by his community? And he said, Dave, he said, I have tears some days when people who come in and say, Jeremy, we had no idea that you had these sort of economic challenges going on. We will write that check. We will support you because we want the Freeman Courier to be around. And he said it just warms his heart every day to hear those stories. And so I think it just demonstrates people do value good journalism, and they want it and are willing to pay for it. So
I want to open it up now to the rest of our panel here and get some questions from them, and then we'll come back to this changing of the model of newspapers. Anybody have any questions for David or comment on things that he has brought to us so far? Anybody? Don't have to all stand up at once. Okay, well, while everyone's thinking, okay, Sharon has something. Go ahead, Sharon. But open your mic. Okay, there you go.
I feel like a rag bag. If you pull something out and we'll throw it out there. I live in Brooklyn. I live in a suburb of Minneapolis now, but I notice in my hometown paper, their niche is sports. That's big in the paper. And then it seems to me also that people like to know what's new, what's going on in the community. And that's something that a big paper can't do. But I think they also like columns. You know, when a writer just writes a column every week, well, so that would be the strong points. That would be the strong points of why you would continue your newspaper and have it print and also on their websites.
Lawrence, if I may, because Sharon brings up a really, really good point here about what has been really a cornerstone of the newspaper forever. And that is that opinion page, that commentary page, editorial page, which is in some ways unique to the newspaper itself, and to have that. And a good newspaper, a good strong newspaper has a good strong editorial page, commentary page, that allows not only the newspaper itself, the newspaper editor, to perhaps write a weekly editorial or commentary, but allows residents and readers to contribute as well. Letters to the editor, columns, opinion pieces. And I think that is so essential, not only to the newspaper itself, but to our society, to our democracy, right? That exchange of ideas and opinion and commentary, and in a civil way, in a discourse through an opinion page on a newspaper is a thing that is to be cherished. And I hope we never lose that, because I think it's something that just contributes mightily to who we are as citizens in a democracy, to be informed, but also to be engaged and be willing to share ideas and contribute that, put that out there for others to read and see. There's a value there that it's an important role for newspapers, obviously, and I'm proud that it still exists, and I hope that never goes away.
My sister in Oakridge is 94 now, and she really loves reading the section of the paper where they have a historical overview, like what happened here in Mobridge in 1960 on this date, in 1950, in 1940, and so on. It does bind the community together in another way that they wouldn't get otherwise.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up, Sharon, because there are so many niches like that in addition to the news, that local newspapers can fill, that that large newspapers, even though technically they could, they won't, because it usually doesn't pencil for them. So I think one of the newspapers around the area I live in, one of the things they did was they had various people in the community to write different columns. And let's say they were a county newspaper where there's lots of little cities in those places that don't have newspapers. And they would recruit people who would write short somewhere between 100 and 500 words weekly to the newspapers. And they were, in a sense, they were more like gossip columns, you know, but it was a kind of a thing where people appreciated, you know, being able to know what their neighbors was doing, you know, without having to purchase a telescope, you know. It was, it was, you know, a very convenient way to, you know, to be aware, you know.
This would be decades ago, but my sister-in-law in Trail City used to write the newspaper for Trail City, and she had a column, and each week you would see Mr. and Mrs. Jones visited Mr. and Mrs. Scheinecker this week.
Exactly.
The whole column of who visited whom.
Exactly. And that, and
But-
when I read the first time I read that, you know, when I came to South Dakota, I was reading saying, why would anybody care about that? But I learned that it not only was a thing, but I started to understand that no, that is important, because it helps you to understand relationships and who's connected to who.
Right.
And that's a thing, and that gives you a sort of sense of where your place is. You know, if everybody's getting invited to dinner except you, then maybe, you know, maybe you want to change your deodorant or whatever, you know.
You know, there's another thing, as long as I'm stealing or taking too much time. When I was out, maybe a decade ago or so, and I can't remember if it was McLaughlin or McIntosh, but there was a Native American newspaper out there. I was so happy to see that. And I'm wondering if that's still functioning. Would
Yes.
the guest know that? And I even forget the name of the paper.
You know, I'm not sure, I don't know, Sharon, if the one that out in, I assume it'd be Standing Rock country, perhaps.
It was Cheyenne River, I think.
Okay, Cheyenne River, if that's still or not. But I will tell you, we have some excellent publications serving Indian country across South Dakota today, which is wonderful, obviously, and but doing really, really good journalism within Indian country, keeping people connected as well. And you know, one of the people who became a nationally known journalist from Indian country, a gentleman named Tim Gallego, who started a newspaper in Martin near the Pine Ridge Reservation back in the 1980s, and then went on to start a few other newspapers. And Tim just died here a few years ago. But Tim was a wonderful Native American journalist who worked tirelessly, you know, to promote independent journalism in Indian country, and his legacy lives on today, and it's really, really good to see.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone else? Vicky, you had something you wanted to add?
Yeah. I must say I have been a little disappointed in the newspaper locally. And because I come from California, I'm told that I have too many new ideas. And I go back and forth. And so when the newspaper was taken over by another person, I called them and I said, gosh, would you be interested in some of this stuff? I'm interested in regenerative agriculture, and we are very rural. Could you, do something in this area? The Green Sheet, I think it's called. Their advertisers, I understand, have to do with chemicals and so forth, but I was really keen on getting environmental issues out there. And so I went around and some things I'm involved in, and submitted people that they could contact and have an interview with them, and to bring the good news to this newspaper. And they said, sure, submit it. I submitted a lot of stuff, and none of it was written. And I couldn't understand. And from then on, I was kind of went away kicking my the dirt, okay, I'm not going to read you anymore. If you don't do my ideas. I know that's childlike, but I think it's really important for the community to recognize these new agricultural issues that we really need to implement. We need to do it now. Excuse me. And I thought, well, there aren't enough advertisers in this old newspaper, but I had the feeling that they don't want to change the format, because she said, I'm open, I'm non-political, I'll take this on. And it just didn't happen. And I'm wondering why that doesn't happen. Is the community so geared up to the same paper all the time? They don't want anything changed? Or is it possibly that new ideas, it's not the place for new ideas? Because a lot of people aren't there yet. They haven't been educated in the area of regenerative ag. Could it be that way, that in these smaller communities that they're so set on having this newspaper, like they like it for so long, they absolutely won't change, and they won't entertain the new ideas? Or if it might be too new, they don't want to hear that in their local newspaper.
Vicki, you're absolutely right. I don't disagree with you in many respects. I know too many newspaper publishers, editors who are too set in their ways to exactly what you're talking about. And I, newspapers are very reflective of a newspaper editor's personality, right? I mean, the person who controls the content that goes in newspaper, that personality is reflected in that newspaper. There's no doubt about it. Yeah. So I hear what you're saying. I mean, I can't argue with it a bit. I would just encourage you to look for a news outlet that could perhaps be open to what you're talking about. I mean, for instance, entities such as South Dakota Searchlight or South Dakota Newswatch, who take on some of those types of topics and issues at times, maybe they would be entertained looking at that as a future story idea that would be worth exploring. Because I certainly hear what you're saying in terms of being open to new ideas at times. There is that, yes.
And I think that goes along with that, David, is that people don't hear something the first time you say it, and they may not hear it the 10th time you say it, but the 101 time you say it, then it sort of gets through. It's like, it's like kind of like how the eye sees. It doesn't see the whole thing at one time. It sees maybe the outline, but it can't make good sense of it. But it has to go back in the brain to sort of figure something it connects to, and all that kind of mechanism goes on before it can actually physically see the object. And I think the brain has that same kind of problem, is that when something new is introduced, if it doesn't have something to connect it to, seeing that thing is not impossible, but very difficult. That's why in a teaching pedagogy, or the way that people teach, they're always trying to link it to something that the person knows already and build on that. So I think that says, okay, the first time they read it, call them back another 6 weeks or 6 months and say, hey, that idea I gave you, do you need me to send that to you again?
Keep trying.
Or how many copies do I need to send you, in order for you to get it, and I do like David's idea of introducing it to some other people, because nothing moves things like competition. When other people see that somebody else is doing it and they get any kudos or even mentioned for it, then suddenly they want to say, me too. I mean, you could see that in your local community when you introduce an idea for a community project. And often people will say, oh, that'll never work here. That'll never work here. Then the city next to them or someplace else tries it. And then suddenly everybody's on board. See, we should have done that. Yeah, but you were saying no before, So that's a thing, So I would say, don't give up. Yeah. Anyone else has any questions before we go on? Okay, we may have another opportunity for that, but I want to go back to under the hood, you know, and what is going to drive kind of like the change that Vicky was talking about. There are lots of potential ideas out there. How do people interact with what's the best way for people to interact with their newspaper and become part of the fabric of what that newspaper could become? So instead of being a passive participant in a newspaper, they become part of that newspaper's family. Even if they don't, quote, contribute a large sum of nonprofit money, they provide something more, probably more tangible, and that is an interworking between, if there's a conversation between the community and the newspaper that serves it.
And that's a really good question, Lawrence, and I appreciate you bringing that up, because I would encourage people to be proactive in terms of seeking out that interaction with a newspaper editor or a publisher or a reporter, someone who's creating content for your newspaper that you're interested in or subscribe to. Give them feedback, ask questions about things that you read or don't see, things that you see in the newspaper or things that you don't see in the newspaper. Because oftentimes, editors can't work in vacuums. They need that interaction, that feedback from subscribers and readers. And sometimes they don't get that. I mean, I'll be honest, you think a newspaper, the issue hits the street and it's out there, and all of a sudden the editor's phone is ringing out the hook. Well, sometimes an issue hits the street and they don't hear anything. And then sometimes that can be the worst, because they wonder, well, what's happening out there? So I would just encourage people to be very proactive in terms of seeking out your local newspaper editor, reporter, and letting them know what you think about what they're seeing and reading in that newspaper. And also, letters to the editor is another way to interact with the newspaper and to comment or provide opinion or ideas on maybe it's something in the newspaper or something within the community. A good newspaper appreciates good letters to the editor. That's always a good thing to have as well. So, but it all starts, I think, with just looking to seek out and talk to the folks who run that newspaper, because they do want to hear from you, and I think that's very helpful.
I think the thing that it brings up when you say that, David, is that people underestimate their personal power. Like they think, oh, nobody's going to read that letter. Editors do read the letter because they have to read those letters. The survival of their newspaper depends on it, because that's their feedback. It's like if you're walking around and you can't feel the floor, it's hard to walk. So you need to fill the floor to give you feedback as to what your next step is going to be. If you don't have that, you can't operate. So there's that, and it's also the underestimation of like how your coffee talk or your cocktail talk or your over the dinner table talk about that, the ripple effect of your conversation about something you read in the newspaper is highly underestimated. That's what gives the newspaper its power. It's not the ink, and it's not the paper. It's the thoughts that are communicated with those. So that says to me that all of us could do well to be more involved with the newspaper.
It's you're exactly right. It's the conversation that's created because of what's in the newspaper, right, within the community, that is so important, so valuable. And having that conversation among citizens, among readers within a community about important things that are happening within a community are essential, because as we know, on a bigger scale, there's too much noise and not enough civil conversation happening out there. And I just hope that newspapers can help contribute toward getting us back to more civil conversation about things that are important to us and to our communities and to our fellow man.
Yes, yes. On that note, let's talk about where the challenges and of newspapers going forward, and how newspapers are planning to, or how they might go on to meet those challenges.
Yeah, so like I said, despite the fact that we talked earlier about all these headwinds and these challenges economically that newspapers and the news industry face, and there certainly is a lot of that. But at the same time, there's disruption and things that are changing also create opportunity as well. And so you're seeing that too, these sort of ways for news entities to move forward, to be sustainable going forward, whether it's through other economic ventures that they're working on right now and yet to come. But there's also there's talk about what can federal government do to help support the news industry in ways that they haven't maybe considered in the past. And there's one of the things that's happening in globally is where Google and Facebook are paying revenue, contributing revenue to local news operations, because what has happened for so long is Google and Facebook have used the local news content on their own feeds, but yet have not compensated the folks who actually created that local news content, often local newspapers. And so in Australia and Canada, and now as well as in parts of Europe, where those large tech giants, global Google and Facebook, are now contributing revenue to local news entities that help compensate for the use of that local content. We're hoping to maybe see that happen in the United States as well. It's not happened yet, but perhaps it will in sometime in the future. That could be a good thing going forward. But it's still at the end of the day, Lawrence, it's an open book in terms of where this is all headed, where we're headed. And at times I have fears that we won't have good answers in terms of sustainability for local news industry, and other times I feel good about it. So it's not an easy answer there, but we have to keep working at it. I mean, we can't give up, because having, again, people who are informed about what's happening within their communities, within their state, within the nation, is just essential to a good democracy, a healthy democracy. Without it, our problems get much, much bigger. So
let me throw out an idea just to get feedback. I'm not selling the idea, but I as long as you're here and we have other co-conspirators on this call, I want to throw out an idea. It seems to me, it occurred to me, I would say, during this conversation, that the SDNA is uniquely positioned to create a trust fund for small newspapers. In other words, especially being a nonprofit, to set up a trust fund that all those people who say, hey, we want to see newspapers, and maybe I don't have $1 million, but I got 1,000 that I could throw in a pot, and you get enough of those thousands and create a trust fund where you're actually, the principle stays the same, but you're starting to use the proceeds to support the small newspapers. And now that is a crowdsourced funding that you just administer, basically.
yeah.
And they could even, I mean, the devil would of course be in the details, but it would seem to me that that's a way that Joe Q public could say, hey, I don't have 1,000, but I got 50, and you get enough of those 50s and it's a thing,
And that's a really, really good idea. And you're seeing some of that happening in other parts around the country. And we've talked to some degree about that within our own association as well. Obviously, we don't have anything that's off and running on that front. But imagine the idea where, you know, where you did have a quote, a trust fund or crowdsourcing funding would help sustain local journalists and reporters in communities across the state. That obviously would be a very, very good thing, and something that's worthy of exploration, no doubt about it.
Right. Well, I'm going to open it up one more time for one more question from the audience before we go into our final detail. Vicki looked like she's chomping at the bit.
Yeah. I had a thought. Recently, I've been looking at the Dakota Scout, because friends of mine said, why don't you look at this? And then there's another one, the Free Press, which I don't know how they make their money, because they really step out there and take a hold of ideas that are hard. But I'm wondering, when they do that, you can get their articles free, but you're limited to how much you see. But if you subscribe, you get the whole thing. And I know for me, I have to go to the internet to get the information I really want. So I'm wondering if this is a step that's going to take away from the newspapers, because they're going to say, these small town newspapers are going to say, if I want the latest information, I'm going to go to the internet. But is this like a step where they just give you a short column for free, and otherwise you subscribe, and then you never get a paper, but you can get it on the internet? What is that about?
Right. So, you know, many newspapers, news entities have gone to what you're talking, sort of a paywall, where you can see a little bit of the content, a little bit of a story, or maybe one or two stories. But if you want more, then you have to go beyond the paywall. You have to pay a subscription or pay a fee to access that. And quite honestly, that's, you know, all goes back to, you know, our expectation has been forever that everything on the internet should be free, including information, news and information. And for a long time, news entities provided content for free, thinking, well, we'll just put ads around the website page and that'll help pay for it. Well, they couldn't sell enough ads to help pay for it, so then they created these paywalls. And quite honestly, Vicki, it all comes back to, you know, if you value that news and information, are you willing to, you know, pay a fee or pay a subscription price that will allow you to go beyond that paywall to see the rest of the story and the other content? And that's what publishers are doing today, is trying to entice and encourage you to, you know, pay that subscription so you can have access to all their content that exists behind the paywall.
Well, I think we're getting near the end. Thank you, Vicki, for that question. We're getting near to the end of our time here. David, did you have any last things that you wanted to let folks know so they can go back and gossip about it? You know?
Well, I just want to say thank you, Lawrence, for the invitation, for the time and the conversation, and thank you to everyone who's been on here this morning. It's been wonderful, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this. Obviously, something I'm very, very interested in. And but I would also encourage anyone who, if you have questions, to feel free to contact our organization, contact me. You can go to sdna.com, South Dakota NewsMedia Association.com, and you'll find our contact information. I'd be happy to continue conversations or help you find other information you may be looking for regarding any news entities in South Dakota. So thank you for the opportunity.
Great. Well, and on that note, I would like to also encourage all of you to pay attention to what's happening in your local newspapers, and supporting them. There's all kinds of ways, and we've talked about some of them here today. I think this conversation has certainly encouraged me to be more involved in the development of spreading news through the folks who are closest to us in terms of creating our reality by writing news articles. And don't underestimate, by the way, your own potential contributions. And a lot of people think of newspapers as just writing. But if you see something that's happening, even if you don't understand it, but it's something that you think is important, snap a picture and send it to your newspaper, because that's one of the things they lack. They can have writers who maybe make a phone call and then, write a story about something, or they can hear about something. But one of the things they don't have is pictures. Now, some people, if their people didn't take it, that they get into a thing, they don't want to use it. But a lot of people, those pictures are valuable, and the larger newspapers, if they get a picture that tells a story, they pay you for the picture and right to use it. But I think that's the thing too. It's like if you see something like, let's say you're upset about the streets not being clean or broken or potholes or something, nothing sells that story like a picture of a pothole, and or a broken axle from the pothole, I mean, now that's a story that they're going to print, With that, I want to thank everybody for joining us today, and hope you will come back next week, same time, same station, with Brainstorming the Human Connection. Goodbye.
Thank you.